hands behind your back, 64 years old or not." The pharmacist's voice cracked through the drugstore like a whip, and Constance Wheeler felt the cold metal bite into her wrists before she understood what was happening. "Don't tell me you didn't know what you were doing when you walked out that door." Officer Dale Pruitt yanked her arm higher, and pain shot through her shoulder, the same shoulder she'd thrown out years ago hauling laundry carts at the hospital where she'd scrubbed floors for 3 decades. "Please," she whispered, "I paid for everything. Check the receipt." "I don't need a receipt to see a thief," Pruitt snapped. The crowd by the registers had stopped pretending not to watch. Phones rose like a wall of small black eyes. Then the automatic doors at the front of the store hissed open, and the air in the room seemed to change before anyone turned to look. 2 women walked in wearing the deep navy of United States Air Force dress uniforms, silver oak leaves gleaming on their shoulders, and the taller one fixed her eyes on the officer's hand still locked around Constance Wheeler's arm. "Take your hand off our mother," she said, and her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Officer Dale Pruitt had no idea that the frail-looking woman he'd just dragged across a pharmacy floor had raised 2 lieutenant colonels who were about to take his badge apart piece by piece. The story everybody in Millhaven, Ohio would later tell about that Tuesday afternoon always started at the drugstore. But for Constance, it started 3 days earlier, with a phone call from her granddaughter Imani about a science fair project and a stethoscope toy that cost $12.99. Constance didn't have grandchildren of her own blood, not really. Not in the way people meant when they said it, but she'd raised her sister's daughter's girl since the child was 4. After her own mother went into a facility for reasons nobody in the family liked to discuss out loud. Imani was 8 now, sharp as a tack, obsessed with the idea of being a doctor, and she'd asked Constance for a toy doctor's kit so badly that Constance had started setting aside $2 a week from her Social Security check, tucking it into an old mint tin she kept behind the flour canister. Constance Wheeler had worked at Millhaven General Hospital for 31 years, first as a custodian and then, after she got her certification at the community college on weekend classes, as a nursing assistant on the 3rd floor. She'd retired 4 years back with a pension that didn't stretch as far as anybody promised it would, and these days she filled her hours with church, with Imani, and with the careful, almost ceremonial business of making her money do more than it should. She wore the same blue raincoat, whether it rained or not, because it made her feel presentable, and she always counted her change twice before leaving a register, a habit left over from a childhood where every penny had somewhere to go before it arrived in your hand. The drugstore on Larkspur Avenue had a toy aisle wedged between the greeting cards and the seasonal candy, and that's where Constance found the stethoscope kit, a cheap plastic thing in a box with a smiling cartoon child on the front, marked down to $9.99 because the box was slightly crushed. She held it like it was made of glass. 12 weeks of saving, and she'd come in $2 under what she expected, but the markdown had saved her. She tucked the box under her arm and went looking for batteries, too, because the toy stethoscope needed 2 AAs to make the little heartbeat sound, and the batteries were back near the registers in a locked case that required an employee to open. A young clerk named Felicity unlocked the case for her, dropped the batteries in a small paper bag, and rang up both items together. Constance paid in cash, $14 and change, counted out from the mint tin she'd brought specially, because she didn't trust herself not to spend grocery money if she used her debit card. She got her receipt, folded it into her coat pocket out of habit, and turned to leave. That was when the alarm at the door screamed. The sound ripped through the drugstore, bouncing off the fluorescent-lit aisles, and Constance froze the way a small animal freezes when a shadow crosses overhead. A man in a blue polo with a store badge clipped to his chest was already moving toward her, and behind him, hovering at the edge of the registers with her arms crossed, stood the assistant manager, a woman named Priscilla Okafor, whose tag read Store Management in stiff capital letters. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there," the badge man said. "I paid for everything," Constance said, her voice already trembling, though she tried to keep it steady. "I have the receipt right here." But Priscilla Okafor was already talking over her, loud enough for the whole front of the store to hear. "She's been in the security mirror 3 times this week, circling that toy aisle. I told Felicity to watch her. Something's not right." The batteries, Constance tried to explain. Maybe the case on the batteries set it off. They're sometimes sensitive. I know what I saw on the cameras, Priscilla Okafor said, and there was something underneath her certainty that didn't sound like simple suspicion. It sounded rehearsed. She turned to the badge man. Call it in. We can't have people thinking they can just walk in here and take what they want. By the time Officer Dale Pruitt arrived 11 minutes later, the small crowd of customers had grown into a small crowd of spectators, and Constance Wheeler was standing very still in the middle of it, her mint tin clutched in one hand, her bag with the stethoscope kit in the other, feeling every year of her 64 settle down hard on her shoulders. Pruitt didn't ask her name. He didn't ask for her side. He looked at her blue raincoat, at her sensible shoes, at the way her hands shook, and he had already decided. Empty your bag, ma'am, he ordered. I have my receipt, Constance said, holding it out with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Receipts can be from anything, he said, not even looking at the paper. Empty the bag. She did. The toy stethoscope kit tumbled onto the counter along with the small box of batteries, both items still sealed in the store's own bag, the receipt stapled right to the outside the way the clerk always did it. Felicity, the young cashier who'd rung her up, stood frozen near the register, looking like she wanted to say something and didn't know how. That's not what set off the alarm, Priscilla Okafor said quickly, before anyone could examine the receipt too closely. Check her coat pockets. I saw her slip something into that coat. Pruitt's hand went into the left pocket of Constance's raincoat, the one she always kept the mint tin tucked into when she wasn't holding it, and his fingers closed around something hard and unfamiliar. He pulled it out, and the whole store seemed to inhale at once. A small bottle of prescription pills, the label scratched off, sat in his palm like a piece of evidence in a television courtroom. I never seen that before in my life, Constance said, and her voice broke clean in half on the last word. That is not mine. Theft and possession of a controlled substance, Pruitt said, already reaching for his handcuffs. That's a felony, ma'am. That's serious time. Please, Constance whispered, the dizziness she always got when her blood pressure spiked starting to creep up behind her eyes. I'm 64 years old. I cleaned floors at the hospital for 31 years. Why would I steal a child's toy and then put something like that in my own pocket where anybody could find it? But Pruitt wasn't listening anymore, and neither was the small crowd, whose phones were already up, already recording, already deciding the shape of a story they would tell their friends that night, the story of an old woman caught red-handed at the drugstore on Larkspur. The cuffs clicked shut. The metal was cold and it bit, and Constance's knees nearly gave as Pruitt began walking her toward the door, past Felicity's stricken face, past the rows of greeting cards she would never get to look at for Imani's birthday, past Priscilla Okafor's expression, which, if anyone had looked closely enough, held something colder and more satisfied than simple civic duty. It was at that exact moment that the front doors hissed open again, and two women in Air Force dress blues walked in, fresh from the base 40 minutes away, where they'd just finished a recruiting event at the regional armory. They had stopped at the drugstore on their way to dinner because their mother had texted that morning, asking if they wanted to meet her for a burger after she ran one quick errand. Take your hand off our mother, said the taller one. Lieutenant Colonel Renata Voss, and her sister Major Bridget Voss, was already moving to the other side of their mother, putting her body between Constance and the gathering crowd's stares. Officer Pruitt's grip loosened, just slightly, the way a man's grip loosens when the ground under him shifts without warning. "Excuse me?" he said. "You heard her," Bridget said, her voice low and tight with a fury that had nowhere yet to go. "Remove your hands from our mother right now." Priscilla Okafor stepped forward fast, trying to reclaim the narrative before it slipped further from her grasp. "This woman is under arrest for shoplifting and possession. I don't care what uniform her daughters are wearing." "What evidence, exactly?" Renata asked, her tone even, controlled, the same tone she used when briefing a room of nervous junior officers before a deployment. "Because I'd like to hear it, slowly, and I'd like to see the receipt that's stapled to the bag sitting right there on your counter." The crowd, sensing that the story was no longer simple, began to lean in. The Millhaven Police Department's holding area smelled like burnt coffee and bleach, and Constance Wheeler sat on a metal bench with her wrists finally free, rubbing the raw red marks the cuffs had left. while her daughters argued through the thin wall with a desk sergeant about why no one had checked the pill bottle for fingerprints yet. Renata Voss had spent 6 years as an intelligence officer before transferring to recruiting command, and the instinct for spotting an inconsistency hadn't left her just because she'd traded a SIF for a strip mall storefront. The label scratched off, she said quietly to her sister. That's not what a careless thief does. That's what somebody does who wants a bottle that can't be traced back to a real prescription. Somebody planted that. Bridget had already called Imani's mother, who was already calling a lawyer, a sharp, weary woman named Harriet Sloane, who ran a small practice 3 blocks from the courthouse, and who had, over 20 years, developed a particular specialty in cases nobody else in town wanted to take. Sloane arrived within the hour, flipping through Pruitt's incident report with visible disgust. He's written here that you became combative and resisted arrest, she said to Constance. Did you do that? I have never resisted anything in my life except the urge to say something smart to people who deserved it, Constance said. And despite everything, Bridget laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound that broke some of the tension in the room. That language in the report will hurt you with the magistrate, Sloane said. Makes you sound dangerous instead of like what you are. We need the security footage from that store, and we need it before they decide it had a, quote, technical malfunction. It had already malfunctioned, as it turned out. When Sloane called the store that evening, the manager on duty informed her, with practiced regret, that the in-store camera covering the toy aisle and the front registers had been down for routine maintenance since that morning. 9 hours, Sloane said afterward, reviewing her notes with her sister, who'd become her unofficial second investigator on these kinds of cases. 9 hours of maintenance on exactly the morning this happens. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern, and patterns mean somebody's done this before. It took 2 days of bail hearings, of reporters showing up outside the small brick courthouse, with cameras trained on a 64-year-old woman in a wrinkled blue raincoat, of a county prosecutor named Wesley Thorne standing on the courthouse steps, describing what he called a troubling pattern of organized theft rings, targeting local pharmacies. 2 days during which Renata used every favor she'd built across a career of recruiting events and community partnerships to find people willing to talk. The first person who talked was a stock clerk named Donovan Pratt, who cornered Bridget in the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles from the drugstore, looking over his shoulder like he expected to be followed. I seen Miss Okafor bump into that lady on purpose, he said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I was stocking the candy display right there. She had something in her hand before she even got close to your mother. I didn't say nothing because Priscilla's been doing this a long time and she's got friends, and I got 2 kids and rent due on the 1st. Friends, Renata repeated, when Bridget relayed it to her that night. What kind of friends does a drugstore assistant manager have that scare a grown man into silence? The answer came from an unlikely place. The drugstore's regional district manager, a tired, careful man named Forrest Calhoun, who, after Sloane subpoenaed 2 years of incident reports from every Larkspur Avenue location in 3 counties, found himself staring at a pattern even he couldn't ignore. 5 prior incidents in 18 months, all at stores where Priscilla Okafor had worked, all involving black women over the age of 60, all resolved with plea deals because none of the women had the resources to fight back. 2 of them, it turned out, had lost part-time jobs over the charges. One had a stroke during the stress of her court proceedings and never fully recovered her speech. And every single time, Sloane said, laying the files across her desk like a hand of cards, the store's loss prevention insurance paid out a bonus to staff for, quote, successfully reducing shrinkage. Theft going down on paper made Priscilla Okafor look like a star employee. Real thieves probably never got caught at all. She just needed numbers, and old women who couldn't afford lawyers were easy numbers. But why my mother, specifically? Bridget asked. And why the pills? That's different from the other cases. That's not just shoplifting. That's attempted to make her look like a drug case. It was Constance, sitting quietly in the corner of Sloane's office, with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, who finally connected the last piece. I know that woman, she said suddenly. Priscilla Okafor. I didn't recognize her face right away because it's been years, but I know that name. Her mother was Geraldine Okafor. I took care of her on the 3rd floor of Millhaven General. back near the end, when nobody else wanted that shift because she was difficult, real difficult. Used to scream at the staff, throw things. I was kind to her anyway because that's the job. But there was an incident, a missing watch from her room, gold, expensive, and the family accused half the nursing staff of stealing it before they finally found it had slipped down behind the radiator. Geraldine Okafor told everybody who'd listened that I was the one who took it, even after they found it. Said I should have been fired. I wasn't, because there wasn't a shred of proof, but I remember her daughter coming to visit once, real cold eyes, standing in the doorway looking at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. The room went quiet. That's not a coincidence, Renata said slowly. That's revenge. The break that finally cracked the case wide open came from somewhere nobody had thought to look. The drugstore's automated pharmacy counting robot, a small machine in the back room that photographed every pill bottle that passed across the dispensing counter for inventory and insurance purposes, uploading its footage automatically to a third-party compliance server that had nothing to do with the store's internal security system. Sloane's paralegal found it listed in an obscure vendor contract buried in the discovery documents. And when the footage finally came through, 2 weeks before trial, it showed everything. Priscilla Okafor at the pharmacy counter that morning, palming an unlabeled bottle of pills from a returns bin meant for expired medication disposal, tucking it into her cardigan pocket, then walking out to the front of the store 15 minutes before Constance Wheeler ever set foot through the doors. The footage also caught audio, faint but clear enough, of Priscilla Okafor on a phone call in the break room an hour earlier. "I told you I'd find a way to make this one stick," she said to whoever was on the other end. "The old ones don't fight. They never do. They just take whatever you give them." When Harriet Sloane played that recording in open court, the gallery, packed with people from Constance's church, and half the third-floor nursing staff from Millhaven General, who'd come out in support once word spread, went dead silent, then erupted, and Judge Eleanora Vance had to bang her gavel twice to restore order. Officer Pruitt, called to the stand to explain his report, began to sweat through his uniform shirt as Sloane walked him line by line through the inconsistencies. And by the time she asked him directly whether he'd checked the pill bottle for fingerprints before charging a 64-year-old woman with a felony, he had no answer that didn't sound like an admission. The county prosecutor, Wesley Thorne, who had stood on those courthouse steps describing organized theft rings, dropped all charges against Constance Wheeler that same afternoon. His press conference, considerably shorter and considerably less confident than the one 2 weeks earlier. Priscilla Okafor was arrested before she left the courthouse parking lot, charged with falsifying police reports, evidence tampering, and elder abuse, the last charge carrying enhanced penalties given the pattern Sloane had documented across 5 other women, 4 of whom came forward once the news broke, finally willing to speak after years of carrying their own quiet shame. Officer Dale Pruitt was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, then quietly resigned before that investigation concluded, the department citing in its brief public statement a failure to follow proper arrest procedure. He did not, notably, ever apologize to Constance Wheeler directly. The recruiting command held its annual community appreciation ceremony at the Millhaven Veterans Hall 6 weeks later, an event Renata had helped organize long before any of this happened, meant to honor local families who'd sent multiple children into service. She hadn't planned to make it about her mother, but 3 days before the event, the local news ran a feature on the case, complete with the recovered pharmacy footage, and by the time the ceremony rolled around, half the town wanted to see Constance Wheeler walk through that door. She wore a new dress for the occasion, pale yellow, the first thing she'd bought herself in 2 years that wasn't on sale. Imani held her hand the whole way up the center aisle, wearing a small toy stethoscope around her neck, the same crushed box $12 kit that had started everything, because Constance had refused to let it go to evidence storage, and Sloane had fought to get it back as a personal item. When Renata took the podium to present the ceremony's final award, she set aside her prepared remarks. "Every commendation pinned to this uniform," she said, her voice steady but rougher than usual, "started with the decision a poor woman made a long time ago to take in 2 girls nobody else wanted and raise them like her own blood, even when she had nothing extra to give. Bridget stepped up beside her sister. She worked double shifts so we could have band uniforms. She walked to the hospital in the snow because she gave the bus fare to us for school trips. The world looked at her coat and her shoes and decided she didn't matter enough to ask a single question before they put her in handcuffs. They were wrong. They have always been wrong about women like her. The hall rose to its feet, the applause building slow and then thunderous. And Constance Wheeler stood between her daughters with her chin up and her eyes wet, no longer the woman who had been marched out of a drugstore in cuffs, but something the town had finally belatedly learned to call by its right name. A few months later, on an ordinary Saturday morning, Constance walked back into that same drugstore, not because she had to, but because she refused to let one bad afternoon own the rest of her life. Imani skipped ahead of her toward the toy aisle, already reaching for a chemistry set this time, and behind the counter, a new assistant manager, a kind-faced young man who'd heard the whole story from his staff, came around just to ask if she needed any help finding anything at all. "No, baby," Constance said, smiling for the first time in that store, without a flicker of fear behind it. "I know exactly where everything is."